Hey guys, this is just merely a recap for the last week. So basically a week in review, even though today is Thursday. So for the past week, we have been working on ancient Egypt, and we know that there are many similarities between ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia, just in the fact that they are both river valley civilizations. So Mesopotamia grows up along the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, whereas Egypt grows up along the Nile River. So just follow along with me for a bit just to recap what we've learned in the last week before we move forward. So like I said, guys, Egypt, as we've learned, grows up along the Nile River. And here you can see the map of the Nile River. And what's interesting about Egypt and the way that the Nile River flows is that the Nile River flows from the southern portions of Egypt all the way until it hits the Mediterranean Sea, and that is the northern portions of Egypt. So usually when we look at a map, we in our brains think that the Nile or any river flows from top to bottom or north to south. And really, it just flows from what's really, really tall to what's really low, which is why southern Egypt is actually called Upper Egypt and northern Egypt is called Lower Egypt. And that has to do with the land elevation which the Nile flows through. So some of the things that I want to recap today are going over the 8 common factors of a civilization. And we know that those 8 common factors are cities, organized government, complex religion, social classes, public works, arts and architecture, writing, and I'm missing one. And the last one is job specialization. Remembered it. So just going through some basic things. So here on the map, guys, we see that Egypt does in fact have cities. That's all it means by an 8 common factor of having cities. So we see P or Pei, we see Memphis, Thebes, Elephantine. We see all of these cities on the map, and we're going to do a little bit more exploration today about what we can find in those cities. From the video that we watched on Monday, we know that the government in ancient Egypt is organized by families, and that is called a dynasty. So a dynasty just means that family or that power is being passed down from generation to generation. So from father to son, or sometimes in the case of Egypt, from mother to son, or from father to daughter. And their leaders are called pharaohs. So it's really important to know that their leaders are called pharaohs. We also know that in ancient Egypt, they worshipped many different gods. And their gods usually have to do with things that have to do with the land, or what their higher beliefs are. And when you worship more than one god, this is called polytheistic or polytheism, to worship many gods. And so they would often pray or offer sacrifices to these gods to help them accomplish their goals. And in many instances, the pharaoh was considered a living god. And so their complex religion and their organized government are very closely tied together. Now, when we think of Egypt, a lot of us are going to be thinking about the pyramids and mummies. And this has a lot to do with their complex religion because, as you can see here in the chapter I'm looking at that we read earlier this week, that they have an emphasis on the afterlife. So they really believe in preserving one's life after death. And they do so through mummification, and burying people in pyramids or temples that they surround them with all of the stuff that they would need in their life. Social classes in ancient Egypt are just like in any other society, where the people that have the most power are at the very, very top, and there are the fewest of them. And then the people who are at the very bottom have the least power, and they are the greatest group or the biggest group. And so here you can see that at the top of our Egyptian society, we have the pharaoh, and he rules Egypt as a god. Under the pharaoh, we have nobles. So these are officials and priests, which help to run the government and the temples. Underneath that, so the third largest group, is the scribes and the craftspeople. So this also lends itself to our job specialization. We know that people would train to be like to learn how to write and how to create certain goods. So a lot of times, my loves, the social pyramid also shows us job specialization. And then the last social class on our Egyptian society pyramid are farmers, servants, and slaves. And we see here that most Egyptians are farmers. Um, and again, because Egypt is a river valley civilization, we know that the people who farmed needed to use the water from the Nile River. And to do that, we had to predict when it was going to flood. And when it floods, it brings that silt, the really fertile soil that we know from Mesopotamia. And when it brings that silt, it makes it so that the crops can grow in abundance. And when they have a surplus of crops, they are able to do more jobs. And Egyptians were so, so good at technology that their versions of irrigation surpass most of the other civilizations that we are going to learn about. And let's remember that irrigation is a public work, which is one of our 8 common factors. A public work just means that the government pays for it to happen and regulates it through laws so that everybody can benefit and use it. And so they have to have these irrigation ditches created in order to farm the most for their people. Otherwise, it's going to kill the crops. And if they don't know how to use the water properly, they're not going to survive for as long as they did. In the video from Monday's class, we know and follow this young boy on his journey to become a scribe. So again, that is just a nod to our job specialization. And to have job specialization, there has to be specific training. And that video talks specifically about the training that this young boy is going to have to go through in order to become a scribe. And it also talks about how his father was also a scribe. So job specialization in these early civilizations is usually passed down from father to son or from older person to younger person because that's how they learn what they are doing. And so they usually go through some sort of apprenticeship or classes to help them become better at their job. Now, probably one of the most interesting portions to ancient Egypt is the arts and the architecture. And their arts and architecture are tied to all of their other factors of civilization. So when we think of Egypt, my loves, we often think about the pyramids. And the pyramids are so, so important because they do connect to our complex religion. But the fact that the pyramids were even built, or the Sphinx, as you can see here in the picture, was even built, shows us how technologically advanced and smart the ancient Egyptians were. And they often covered the inside of their pyramids and their temples with all sorts of pictures and art forms. So we have lots of art and architecture that has been preserved for us to examine in ancient Egypt, which is awesome. Okay. So this is just another example of arts and architecture. We see the different types of pyramids, which we will talk about later on. We see the Sphinx here. We also see the Nile River or a canal, which is part of irrigation. So everything in ancient Egypt is pretty much connected together. Art is also in Egypt in the form of what the pharaohs and typical people decorated themselves with. So here in the picture, you see there's Queen Hatshepsut, and everything that she's wearing, guys, is actually considered art. We see her very fancy headdress. We see her collars that are usually made of precious stones and metals. We see she has bangles on her wrists. If we come down even further, we see some other items that would be considered art, although this is a perfume jar. It's still something that they had to have made. We also come down here and we see Ramses the Great, and everything he's wearing, again, also is considered art. So it's really interesting to see what it is that these pharaohs are decorating themselves with, because it shows us how the people lived and what they valued during that time. The last of the 8 common factors is the writing portion. And Egypt has probably one of the most interesting ones and most known forms of ancient writing, because they have the hieroglyphics. And the video from Monday's class and our reading from Tuesday's class shows us exactly how difficult it was to write using hieroglyphs. So guys, in conclusion, we know that Egypt has all of these 8 common factors of civilization, and what we're going to do today is we're actually going to explore and go on a traveling journey through Egypt, where we're going to stop at the cities and we're going to take a look at some of their greatest works of architecture and art, and see how we can tie it all together.